When the violet-eyed alien woman grabbed Marcus Chen by his thermal suit and barked those words at him, he thought hypothermia had finally made him hallucinate. But the biting cold snapping at his exposed skin and the very real terror in her luminescent gaze told him this was no fever dream, this was survival, and she wasn't asking. "Are you deaf as well as stubborn?" Xyrath hissed, her pointed ears flattening against her silver hair as another gust of crystalline wind rattled the emergency shelter's failing walls, the temperature gauge blinking a cruel -42 degrees and dropping fast. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but his teeth were chattering so violently he couldn't form words, and before he could process what was happening, she'd yanked him toward the single thermal sleeping pod designed for one person. Her slender fingers, surprisingly strong despite her exhausted trembling. "My people share heat differently than yours," she muttered, shoving him into the pod's narrow confines before climbing in after him, her back pressing against his chest as the insulated cover sealed them in darkness. "Stay still. And don't make this awkward. Human." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus 12 hours ago. This woman had pointed a plasma pistol at his head and told him to stay 50 meters away from her camp at all times. And now they were pressed together like sardines in a can. But 12 hours ago, the ice planet KYRL-7 hadn't entered its polar vortex season, and their respective shelters hadn't been torn apart by 300-kilometer winds. He could feel her heartbeat against his arm, rapid and afraid, could smell something like frost and starlight in her hair. And despite everything, despite being stranded on a planet that wanted them dead, despite her prickly hostility and his own suspicion, Marcus felt oddly calm. "Why were you exiled?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the howling storm outside. Xyrath went rigid. "That's none of your concern." But her voice cracked on the last word, and Marcus realized she was crying, silent tears that she was desperately trying to hide. "I crashed here 3 weeks ago," Marcus offered, giving her something in return, an exchange of vulnerabilities. "Navigation error during a commercial freight run my ships in pieces across the northern ice shelf, and my distress beacon's range is basically non-existent in this atmospheric soup." He paused, feeling her breathing gradually steady. "I thought I was going to die alone on this frozen rock until I saw your campfire 2 days ago." Xyrath was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep, but then she spoke, her voice soft and raw. "I spoke against the Concordat." Marcus blinked in the darkness. The Concordat, everyone in the known systems had heard of them, the vast alien alliance that controlled 30 star systems with absolute authority, beautiful and terrifying in their unity. "I was a historical archivist on Tice Prime," Xyrath continued, and Marcus could hear the ache of homesickness bleeding through every word. "I found records, old records, from before the Concordat unified our people, records showing we weren't always this cold, this controlled, this empty." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We used to feel things, human. We used to create art that made people weep and music that made them dance. And we loved so fiercely it frightened us. But the Concordat called those things inefficient, dangerous, so they bred them out of us over generations. And I committed the greatest crime imaginable. I told people the truth." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. "What happened?" "They held a trial," Xyrath said bitterly. 30 seconds long. "The verdict was unanimous: exile to the furthest uninhabited world in our territory, which, congratulations, is this frozen hell." She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "They took everything, my position, my family, my name, and dropped me here with basic supplies and a warning beacon to keep other ships away. And do you know the cruelest part?" Marcus waited. "I can still feel," Xyrath whispered. "Whatever they did to my ancestors, it didn't quite take in me. I still feel everything. And it hurts so much I wish I didn't." The sleeping pod suddenly felt less like a survival necessity and more like a confessional. A tiny pocket of warmth where 2 broken people could speak truths they'd buried deep. "My daughter," Marcus heard himself say, words he hadn't spoken aloud into years. "Her name was Lily. She died in a medical transport accident when she was 7. And I couldn't save her because I was 3 star systems away on a freight run, making money for a future she'd never see." His throat closed up. "I took the loneliest routes after that, the ones no one else wanted. The deep space halls where you don't talk to anyone for months because I couldn't stand being around families, around happiness, around everything I'd lost." Xyrath's hand found his in the darkness, her skin cooler than human normal, but warming gradually in their shared cocoon. "We're quite a pair," she said softly. "The alien who feels too much, and the human who's afraid to feel at all." Marcus threaded his fingers through hers. "And something extraordinary happened," Zyrith gasped. And suddenly Marcus saw things that weren't his memories, a city of crystalline towers reaching toward twin moons, libraries filled with singing books, a young Zyrith laughing with friends whose faces radiated joy. Then the same faces, blank and empty. Years later, their emotions surgically removed by social conditioning, and Zyrith alone in a vast archive, weeping over the loss of an entire civilization's soul. "Sorry," Zyrith breathed, pulling her hand back. "I should have warned you, my people. The ones who still carry the old genetics. We can share thoughts through touch. It's involuntary when emotions run high." "Do it again," Marcus said firmly, reaching for her hand. "Share with me. You've been alone for weeks carrying all of this. And I know what that weight feels like." Zyrith hesitated, then laced her fingers with his again. And this time Marcus was ready for the flood. He saw her exile, the cold transport ship, the terror of being left alone. But he also saw her determination, her refusal to give up, her secret hope that maybe someday someone would find her records and continue the work she'd started. And because the connection flowed both ways, Zyrith saw his memories to Lily's laugh, the crushing guilt, the slow numbness that had consumed him, but also the tiny spark of hope he'd felt when he saw Zyrith's campfire. The first time in years he'd wanted to survive for something more than mere stubbornness. They lay there in the darkness, hands clasped, sharing everything they'd locked away. And the storm outside raged on, but inside the sleeping pod, something rare and precious was taking root. "When I first saw you," Zyrith admitted, "I was terrified. I thought you were Concordat, coming to finish the job, or worse, to drag me back for public correction. But you were just this lost human, trying to fix a broken unit with spare parts and optimism." Marcus chuckled. "When I saw you pointing that plasma pistol, I thought you were the most beautiful and terrifying thing I'd ever encountered. And then you threatened to vaporize me if I came closer. And I thought, well, at least I'll die with an interesting final view." "You thought I was beautiful?" Zyrith's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "Humans find my people attractive?" "Zyrith, you could stop traffic on Earth," Marcus said honestly. "But that's not what I meant. You were beautiful because you were alive, really alive, angry and fierce and surviving. And I'd forgotten what that looked like." He squeezed her hand gently. "You reminded me why living matters." The temperature gauge on the inside of the pod showed it was still dropping outside, but between them, the space was finally warm. "Tell me about Tice Prime," Marcus said. "Tell me what it was like before." So Zyrith did, painting pictures with words of crystalline architecture and aurora skies, of the old festivals her research had uncovered, of music that existed now only in archived files. And Marcus listened and asked questions, and for the first time since her exile, Zyrith felt truly heard. As the hours passed and the storm's fury peaked, they talked about everything and nothing: Zyrith's fascination with ancient poetry, Marcus's terrible cooking skills, the absurdity of their situation, their fears and dreams, and the lives they'd left behind. "If we survive this," Marcus said during a quiet moment, "come with me. We'll find a colony world far from Concordat space. Somewhere they'll never find you. And you can start over." "And what would I do on this colony world?" Zyrith asked, but there was hope threading through her voice. "Whatever you want," Marcus replied. "Open a library, teach history, help people remember that feeling things isn't weakness, it's what makes us alive." Or he hesitated, then pushed forward. "Or you could help a broken freight pilot remember how to be human again, because somehow in the last few hours, you've made me feel more than I have in years." Zyrith turned in the cramped space, shifting until she faced him in the darkness, her eyes faintly luminescent and searching his face. "You mean that?" It wasn't a question. Every word, Marcus confirmed. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. But Zyrith, I've existed for 2 years without living. And tonight, freezing to death on an ice planet with you, I finally feel alive again." She kissed him. Then, soft and tentative, her cool lips warming against his, and the touch deepened the connection between them. Marcus felt her joy and fear and desperate hope, and she felt his sincerity and grief, and the fragile new thing growing in his heart that might, with time, become love. When they broke apart, both breathless, Zyrith whispered, The old text said that my people used to choose Heartbond's partners who completed their souls and the Concordat bandit because it made us too attached, too willing to choose each other over the collective. Her luminescent eyes locked with his. I think I'm choosing you, Marcus Chen. I'm choosing you too, Marcus replied, pulling her close, tucking her silver-haired head under his chin. Outside, the storm began to weaken, the howling winds dropping to mere gales, and the temperature gauge slowly, incrementally, started to climb. They slept fitfully, wrapped around each other, sharing warmth and dreams through Zyrith's unique gift. And when Marcus woke, it was to silence. The storms passed, Zyrith murmured against his shoulder. They emerged from the sleeping pod into a transformed landscape. The ice planet sparkled under clear skies. The distant sun, casting everything in shades of blue and gold. And Marcus's breath caught because it was heartbreakingly beautiful. Look, Zyrith said, pointing toward the horizon, where a dark shape moved across the ice. Is that ship? Marcus confirmed, his heart leaping. My distress beacon must have finally reached someone. The rescue ship was a small independent trader, the kind that asked few questions and respected privacy. And the captain, a grizzled woman with kind eyes, took one look at Marcus and Zyrith, and simply said, "Rough week." You could say that, Marcus replied, his hand finding Zyrith's. We need passage to the outer colonies, away from Concordat space, and we can work for our fare. The captain studied them, noted their clasped hands, the way they stood together, like they were ready to face down the universe, and nodded. I've got room, and I can always use extra crew. Welcome aboard. As the ship lifted off, Marcus and Zyrith stood at the viewport watching KYRL-7 shrink below them. The frozen planet that had almost killed them, but instead had given them something neither expected to find a reason to keep living. Are you afraid? Marcus asked quietly. Terrified, Zyrith admitted. The Concordat has a long reach, and if they find me, if they take me back, they won't, Marcus interrupted firmly. Because you're not alone anymore, and I won't let them. Zyrith leaned into him, her pointed ears perking up slightly, and what he'd learned was a sign of contentment. You know, when I was dropped on that planet, I thought my life was over, that I'd die alone, having accomplished nothing. She looked up at him, her violet eyes bright. But maybe being exiled was the only way I could be free to feel, free to choose, free to find you. The Concordat wanted to erase your ability to love, Marcus said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Instead, they just gave you the space to find someone worth loving. How poetic, Zyrith teased. Are all humans this sentimental? Only the ones who've been yelled at by beautiful alien women and ordered into bed, Marcus shot back with a grin. Zyrith laughed, really laughed, the sound like bells and starlight, and several crew members glanced over in surprise at the joy radiating from the strange pair. 3 months later, on a colony world called Haven's Rest, where the Concordat held no sway, Marcus and Zyrith stood in front of a small house with a garden plot and enough room for both a workshop and a library. It's perfect, Zyrith breathed, already envisioning the shelves she'd build, the histories she'd write, the truth she'd preserve about her people's past. It's home, Marcus corrected, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. Our home. And as they stepped across the threshold together, Zyrith reached for Marcus's hand, letting the connection flow between them, sharing the profound peace she felt, the sense of belonging she'd never expected to find. And Marcus shared back his own quiet happiness, the feeling that finally, after years of running from grief, he'd found a future worth building. That night, as they lay together in their new home, Zyrith asked, "Do you ever regret it, that navigation error that crashed you on KYRL-7? Marcus pulled her closer, breathing in her frost and starlight scent. Best mistake I ever made, he said simply, because it brought me to you. Outside, Haven's Rest 3 moons rose into a purple sky, casting silver light through the windows, and inside, 2 exiles who'd found each other in the coldest, loneliest place in the galaxy, finally found warmth. Zyrith traced patterns on Marcus's chest, her touch sending little sparks of shared emotion between them. You know what the old text said about heart bonds? She murmured sleepily. Tell me, Marcus said. They said that when 2 souls choose each other, truly choose each other, they become home for one another. That it doesn't matter where in the galaxy they are, because they'll always belong. She looked up at him, her luminescent eyes soft in the moonlight. I used to think I'd lost my home forever, but I was wrong. I didn't lose it. I just hadn't found it yet. Marcus kissed her gently, pouring every ounce of his choice, his commitment, his growing love into that simple touch. And through their connection, Xyrath felt it all, felt herself being chosen every bit as much as she chose him. "Shut up, human," she whispered against his lips, echoing those first desperate words, but this time her voice was warm with affection and joy. "Just hold me." So he did. And somewhere in the vast, uncaring universe, two broken people became whole, not by forgetting their past, but by building a future together, one shared heartbeat at a time. The Concordat had exiled Xyrath to silence her truth, but in doing so, they'd given her the freedom to live it. And that truth was simple and profound, that love, connection, and the courage to feel deeply weren't weaknesses to be eliminated. They were the very things that made life worth surviving, worth fighting for, worth choosing again and again. And as sleep finally claimed them, wrapped in each other's arms, both Marcus and Xyrath smiled, because against all odds, on the coldest planet in the sector, they'd found the warmest thing in the universe, someone who saw all their broken pieces and chose to stay anyway. Years later, when Marcus was old and gray, and Xyrath's silver hair had taken on hints of starlight white, they'd tell the story to anyone who'd listen, about how they met, about the storm and the sleeping pod and the desperate command that saved both their lives. And they'd laugh because the universe has a strange sense of humor, bringing two lost souls together in the most unlikely place. And every night, without fail, before they slept, Marcus would pull Xyrath close, and she'd say in mock sternness, "Shut up, human, we're freezing," even though they were warm and safe. And he'd laugh and hold her tighter, and they'd share their dreams the way only her people could. Two minds and hearts so intertwined that neither could remember what loneliness felt like anymore. But that was later. For now, on their first night in their new home, they simply held each other and rested, two exiles who'd finally, miraculously, found their way home.